All right. Well, I think we've waited long enough for everything to kind of resolve itself. So just to begin, my name is John Flack. I am a pastor at Our Savior's Atonement Lutheran Church in the not the northernmost part of Manhattan, the sub-northernmost part of Manhattan, at the liminal space between Inwood and Washington Heights, right near the Fort Tryon Park and the cloisters and all that stuff. And I'm really excited to be with all of you here today to talk about what I think is the greatest and most important challenge my generation has certainly faced, but perhaps even the generations of humanity, which is basically to make sure we live in a place that can support human life, which we all would like to have. Really thrilled to have our other moderator. I just got muted.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, I was about to introduce you, John. I guess they didn't want me to do that. But John Paulberg is a Reformed pastor, and he's been a member of the New York State Council of Churches for a long time. And he's done a lot of work over the years on environmental justice. So, John, I'd like to.
I think you were muted again, John. And my camera is working intermittently, but yeah, welcome everyone. I also, we want to welcome our panelist, Bob Cohen. Bob is a graduate of State University of New York in Albany and of Rutgers Law School. And he is the policy director for Citizen Action New York, a group which has been very active in helping to move us toward a more just, equitable, and compassionate society in New York, looking on issues of education and housing, healthcare, economic justice, and environmental justice. And he's also been very active in Climate Can't Wait, which is a collaboration of a number of groups, I think 40 some, including the New York State Council of Churches, and including, of course, Citizen Action of New York. And Bob, I'm wondering if you could, maybe first give us a bit of an introduction to Climate Can't Wait, and perhaps especially the Climate Investment Act, Climate Community Investment Act.
Sure, thanks, John. And so first of all, can people hear me? I think my mic occasionally hasn't been the greatest. Good, I have several nodding, that's wonderful. So in terms of Climate Can't Wait, this is not an organization you probably have heard of and seen necessarily in the newspaper, because it is truly what we call a collaborative. It is a, we do have a just recently put out a webpage, climatecan'twait.org, if people want to look at that. It is a collaborative. It isn't a permanent coalition, but we started roughly 4 or 5 months ago, I want to say late summer, because of the concern many climate groups had that either because of the reality or the perception that climate groups were not unified in terms of their policy agenda, that that the legislature did not act and did very little on climate last year. I tend to be honestly on the perception side, which is another way of saying the legislature used it a little bit as an excuse because it's hard to do. But be that as it may, we wanted to put up a unified front, call for climate action, and I'm sure we'll have the opportunity to go into it a little bit more during this hour, but we came up with an agenda of 12 bills or proposals that we all agree are important, not necessarily everything the legislature has to do. And we are mostly focused on mobilizing. In fact, we're going to have an event in Albany on Friday, April 22nd, Earth Day. Hope people are interested in that. So that's the origin of that? And were you, John, you were asking me to also talk about, I assume, the CCIA also? Please remind.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay, so the centerpiece of what Citizen Action and its most closest coalition ally, New York News, is advocating for is the Climate and Community Investment Act. It's in your packet in terms of the bill number. Happy to look it up if people don't have that handy. But essentially what it is it's a comprehensive approach to this moving from where we are today in New York towards 2050. Excuse me, my phone, I will silence it. Apologies. It's a move toward moving from the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which of course is the landmark climate law that was passed in 2019, which essentially set out targets for reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and economy-wide and the electric sector. But basically, it just does that. It sets a target and it has some important environmental justice provisions. But in our position as a coalition, and I think this is pretty self-evident, is that you can't just set a target, state agencies act to impact on business, and then assume that these massive changes are not going to happen without funding. The example I always give is the probably a bad example in terms of bad social policy, but the Interstate Highway Act built all the highways. Government is critical to major systemic changes that involve infrastructure. I think we all know that. So what the bill does, really briefly, and we can certainly go into more detail if people want, but what it does is it places a 55 per ton polluter fee on various types of fossil fuel distribution and extraction, et cetera, in New York State, raises over $10 billion for certain purposes, such as big projects like transit. I'm going to do this really quickly. This is a 10,000 foot view. Big projects like transit, et cetera. Smaller projects selected by communities, could be weatherization, et cetera, based on the needs of that community, reimbursing fossil fuel workers and their communities for the possibility that they will lose jobs due to the transition, and rebates to homeowners and businesses and nonprofits for potentially increased energy costs. So that's sort of a 73-page bill in like 2 minutes, but that's the idea. But again, the philosophy of this bill is that we need governmental funding, New York State funding, to jumpstart the economy, the transition to renewables that will ultimately produce, we think, and our studies that we have contracted for, over 100,000 jobs a year, just with our plan, but more than that. But it's not going to happen just by private industry acting alone.
Thank you, Bob, for that 10,000 foot overview. I want to highlight two things. One is that there's a slew of bills that we'll be advocating for. We're sort of putting the CCIA at the center, the centerpiece of that, but there's a whole lot of really good, worthy legislation that needs to be happening. I'd like us to think back to what Alex Wiesendanger was talking about when we go to lobby visits, because I feel like that's a really important thing for us to think about now with regards to environmental justice, is that we kind of feel that there's going to be a lot of sort of pushback. Bob, you'll probably please correct me if you think I'm saying anything correct here. But there'll probably be some pushbacks to say, well, this is a very progressive budget. You know, there's $1 billion of investment in green energy solutions. And, you know, it's really hard to do this when this is a pandemic and the economy. So, you know, give us some time, and, you know, all these other things. And so we have a kind of a complicated legislative ask we're going to be asking for, which is to say, you did make some changes in the budget. There is $1 billion worth of stuff that you put in here. Unfortunately, that's 1/15 of what we need just this year. We need to get to $15 billion this year in order to make real solutions happen. And we're going to ask them to pick the bills. Like, we have 14 different bills here. Just pass any of them or all of them and make it happen, especially pass the CCIA. But really, you can try any of these and ask them which ones they are committed to passing, which ones they think that they can do. And because, to be quite honest, I think Bob was alluding to this before, is there's an idea out there that the environmental groups don't agree on things. There's a lot of infighting, and that's used as a smokescreen for inaction. But what we really know is we need to act now. We need to act decisively, and we need to meet the crisis that's before us. We can't rely on comparing ourselves to inaction of the past. That's not going to get us to where we need to go. We need decisive action that will meet the crisis as it stands before us now. And so the immediacy of that, the need for that is kind of what we're trying to do. John, if you think it's okay, I'd like to share the legislative ask real quick with the group so they can kind of get a glance at it before we go forward. Does that make sense for you? And then we can open it up for Q&A to Bob.
Yeah, and I think it's good to share the ask. And I don't know if we want to highlight. There are 12 legislative proposals, so it's a fairly hefty list. If we want to highlight a couple of those, or if Bob wants to speak in more detail to a couple of those, that might be something we want to consider as well.
Great.
Sure.
Now, can everybody see the document that I've shared? Bob, you were going to say something? I'm sorry, I interrupted.
Sure. What I was going to say is just a suggestion, and I'm sorry because I've been busy. I'm not necessarily knowing what you all got, but I assume you all got a packet that summarizes all of the bills. But what I've been told, and I sort of acted as an advisor, but you all selected it, your leadership. But maybe I could talk a little bit more about the 4 bills that you yourself selected. One of them, I've already talked about, the CCIA, but I just want to make a general comment about those 12 bills. Actually, one of the bills is more a proposal than a bill. But I just want to say they definitely do present different approaches. So, for example, some are focused more on regulation. Some are focused on getting at ways to pressure the industry to move in the right direction. And I'm thinking of the fossil fuel divestment bill and the fossil fuel subsidies bill. And I personally don't think that it's a question that any one approach is better. We need to do a number of things to affect this transition. So, I think the answer, as I think has already been suggested, to which one should I enact, which one should I support from legislators, is really not to take the bait and say, these are all important approaches. The legislature may have ideas of its own, but we really need to do a number of things to restructure the economy. So, to me, that's the approach. But if that's okay, John, maybe I could just go over the major proposals that you yourself have selected. Your coalition, I believe it's further down on this document.
Yep.
This is the one I'm thinking of.
Yeah, it's all 12 are listed, and then it begins
again,
page 5.
If the one I have in front of me first is the All Electric Buildings Act.
Yeah.
And again, I am supportive of all of these things, but I just want to say that the selection of this was your committee, not myself. I love all my children. Not just I don't have 12 children. I have 2, actually.
Yeah.
So the 4 are the All Electric Building Act, which essentially, it mandates that it actually prohibits municipalities from giving building permits to new construction, residential and commercial, after December 3rd, if the application is after December 31st of 2023, a couple of years away. Incidentally, the governor has proposed, which we think is commendable, that we have a all electric buildings or by 2027. So, that is a positive thing, but we think that given the first target of the CLCP is 2030, that's too little too late. But we have to acknowledge that she is interested and moving in that direction. So maybe there'll be some action in this. The second one is the Fossil Fuel Subsidy Elimination Act. Again, the bill numbers are in your materials. But what this does is actually two things. It one is eliminates a number, not all, of subsidies for the fossil fuel industry. I believe New York's the calculation, I will look at my notes here, is over $1 billion. New York spends $1.5 billion for subsidies of the industry every year, which is, would go 1/15 toward what Citizen Action and New York News thinks we need to begin the transition to all fossil fuels. So that's really a large number. Let's see. So that's really important. The third one, I'm just looking at my list. Forgive me. Is
Can you unfuzz it a bit, or is it me?
excuse me?
My printing is all fuzzed. Is it in anybody else's?
It's out of focus, yeah.
Yeah, it is on mine as well. Not sure what to do about that.
Somebody changed it. It was fine, and then they changed it. Now it's
Yeah.
fuzzy.
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't work
Yes,
for
there it
anybody.
is. Now
There
it's
it is.
better.
Okay. So the third one is, I think it's number 7 on your list for whoever's scrolling. I'm sorry, excuse me. It's the Teachers Fossil Fuel Divestment Act.
Yeah,
And
if you keep scrolling down to page 5 of the
There it
document.
is.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Number 12.
even go farther down and you get the,
That's it.
okay, yeah, there's a more extensive explanation farther down.
yeah, so the Fossil Fuel Divestment Act, and I want to say really generally about divestment. Divestment is a strategy that tries to move industry toward, and it can be used in other contexts. I'm sure people know this. Outside of fossil fuels, for example, I am old enough to have played a role in the apartheid struggle in the early 80s. And as people know, the world divestment movement, divestment from South Africa did play a role in, hurting the system and ultimately bring about freedom for that country. And there's a lot of other movements for that. But anyway, there are fossil fuel divestment movements in campuses, large institutions, churches, et cetera. I think people know that. New York City has divested its retirement fund. New York State, with a lot of pressure, Comptroller DiNapoli is on that path. And this bill picks a new target, which is the New York State Teachers Retirement Fund, which is the fund that provides retirement for not all teachers and professionals in New York State, but the largest number, if I'm correct. And it sets out a schedule for divestment of that retirement fund. And the final one that I've already covered is the CCIA, Climate and Community Investment Act. So those are the ones that you all have picked. And if that's okay, John, could I just back up a little bit and give the context for some of these things, if that's okay? I think it's.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, please.
So I just want to say, all of these legislative actions, it's important to note, are happening in another world, an overlay of the fact that New York State is implementing the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which is the landmark law that was passed in 2019. People who, like us, who go to lobby days like this, are sometimes uncomfortable hearing that this is not a bill because, but I can assure you that so much of what happens that's important to us is not just the legislature. The legislature plays an important role. It's what the state agencies do. And right now, New York State is in the midst of the first stage of implementing this law that I mentioned that reduces greenhouse gases by 85% by 2050, has other targets. Basically, all the state agencies are meeting together in this uber body of all the state agencies called the Climate Action Council, which has put out a plan, a draft plan, as of January 1st, that we have the ability to comment, that lays out how we're going to achieve that 85% reduction. When do electric cars, how fast do they have to be brought online? What do we have to do with agriculture? What do we have to do with those other areas? So it's a rather labyrinthian process, but the bottom line is I would really urge those of you individually and your organizations to, connect with New York Renews. I know you already are, and we have lots of updated information on how to comment and how to impact on that process. Because again, legislation is critical, but so is impacting the state agencies that are basically writing the law as we speak.
Bob, is there a public comment period now? Because my understanding is that plan is out and it's just woefully. My understanding is that it's woefully inadequate. It's just sort of like a. But maybe you could speak to that, and if there is a public commenting thing there, what are some of the main things that people need to express their views on?
Sure, and I should so to answer the first question, it's 120 days after January 1st, and the state interestingly didn't post the exact date it ends. So it's around, if I'm remembering correctly, it's around April. I think it's around May 1st. It's 125 days after January 1st. And forgive me, I'm not a math person, but it starts on January 1st. So we have some time. And New York Renews is gearing up right now to guide that process. We will have webinars. We will have stuff posted on our webpage in a couple of months with the details. But generally speaking, here are some of the highlights of the lowlights. The number one thing to me personally, this is not necessarily the thing New York Renews would say, we don't have a position yet, but to me personally, the single worst thing about it is that it's filled with not mandates. And so governmental agencies, the only way we're going to achieve these reductions is mandating the industries as subject to the agency's jurisdiction. Instead, it's like what a friend of mine has called a white paper. It has a discussion about good ideas, mostly good ideas, sometimes bad ideas. We need to have a way to ensure that industry does comply with that. Not only is that my theory, but that is what the CLCPA says. The CLCPA does not say you need to reduce greenhouse gases industry if you feel like it or you think it's profitable. It says you have to do it. And state agencies are the cops that make sure people comply with the law. Secondly, there's lack of clarity in terms of this important provision of that says 40% of agency funding has to go to disadvantaged community. They haven't fleshed out how that's going to happen, who's going to administer it, all that stuff. Now, they say it's coming, but it's not in the scoping plan. There's a lot of false solutions that people have concerns about, like waste to energy, that people are promoting that are untried. So those are three things that immediately come to mind. But again, it's with the appendices, it's 800 pages. So there'll be lots more on our webpage.
Thanks, Bob. I see a pretty good question here from Ann Erling. She writes, I thought the CCIA was understood to have no chance of passage. The effort to get that passed was replaced with an effort to get $15 billion in investment in the budget. Can you speak to this? Is New York News again pushing the CCIA? Does it have hope of passage? I mean, I feel like I can say that New York News isn't explicitly pushing the CCIA. They're pushing that $15 billion number. What we're asking folks to do in the legislative ask is to say you have pledged in the budget. The budget asks for about $1 billion in investment. We need at least $15 billion of investment this year. We have a slew of bills. Among them is a CCIA. You know, you can pass that as one way of getting to that. But if you don't feel like you can pass the CCIA, pass this, pass that. You know, pass the defund the so not defund the teachers. It's get the teachers' pension plans out of fossil fuels. You know, there's a lot of different ways to go. And I think, Bob, you mentioned earlier how we need to do a lot of different things all at the same time. And I think in this scenario, in my own personal view, is that progress is better than perfection. That, you know, if you chip away at this, if you start getting some of the underlying structures that support the fossil fuel industry, if you start to weaken those, that's better than if we just sit around and plan the best way to get the industry to, you know, to change. So that's why we're pushing a slew of things. Personally, I still say, you know, the CCIA is a good bill. We need $15 billion. You know, go meet the need. Bob, can you address that as well?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, and I know Ann really well, and I just want to say what Ann said is accurate in terms of, but in terms of the assessment that it's not going to pass, but I do want to say a nuance, which is sort of where John was getting at, which is that, you know, if I as Citizen Action, you know, advocate the things just solely on the criteria of whether I thought they were going to pass, then I would have very little to do. And later on your agenda, and believe me, I advocate this bill as well, so I'm not bad mouthing it. Please don't take it that way. New York Health is a bill, that the Gottfried's bill, to replace the current system with a comprehensive healthcare system, has been around for 20 years. So I'm not saying the CCIA will be there too, but it isn't unusual for us to have an aspirational proposal along with working for incremental things, which does not mean people should not support either one of them. So for example, the CCIA, we would urge people to get people who have not sponsored the bill, legislators, to already sponsor it, to have people speak out on it, which means it may pass next year. But yes, we don't think, based on our assessment, it's going to happen this year. And we are that's correct. We're proposing $15 billion for this year as an interim step, and it quite frankly supports many things that, in fact, it overlaps enormously with what the CCIA would have funded. So the idea is we won funding the first year, and we have a plan for how to establish a permanent funding mechanism, and that's the CCIA.
Bob, this is a kind of strategy question, I think. All of these bills have co-sponsors, sponsors and co-sponsors. Some have several. I know the teachers' divestment bill has about 75 co-sponsors. And it would be good for us, before we make our legislative visits, to find out if our assembly person or senator is one of the co-sponsors. But given that, are there some of these pieces of legislation that look like they stand a better chance of passing? And I guess I'm asking, where would our advocacy be most helpful and most critical?
Okay, so I will be happy to say that with this incredible, massive qualification, which is, I believe that, and I've been lobbying a long time in the state legislature, so predicting which bills is going to pass is not like weather prediction. It's like predicting the weather in about a month from now, which is, you know, seriously, unless I'm one of the three, we used to say 3 men and the women in the room. Now it's 2 women and 1 man in the room. And even they don't know for sure, because obviously they have to agree for things to pass. So I think certain things, like looking at it, might have a little bit better possibility, but I hope people don't, based on what I say, drop everything else, because that's why we have 12 bills. We want to give the legislature a chance and let them decide, let them do their job. And that may be selecting things that I'm wrong about in terms of but just a couple of things. They aren't number one. They're just in my mind. They're not the top three or anything like that. So the Electric Buildings Act certainly looks like it has a possibility of moving simply because it's a basic rule of the legislature that you need all three parties, Assembly, Senate, and Governor support. So since we have both two houses of the legislature, moving on the Electric Buildings Act, some senior members and the governor proposing it, then it doesn't mean it'll happen. But it certainly means everybody's looking at it. So perhaps something will happen in that area. Who knows? I would say that, I like to think that at least some additional funding for climate will be put. I'm not going to sit here and predict we'll get 15 billion, but I think that's important to work on. I'm just trying to think if there's anything else beyond that. I think it's really impossible to predict. Certain things, due to their complexity, CCIA would be an example of that. It's hard to imagine them digesting these complex bills really quickly. I know that's a little bit non-responsive, but it's really hard to predict that kind of thing.
Oh, that's good. Thank you. I believe there's also another question from Ann in the chat regarding the relationship between the scoping plan and legislation. The gist of it was, if I'm understanding this correctly, how do we put teeth in the recommendations of the scoping plan?
Okay, so here's the thing, and that is the proverbial. They used to say $64,000 question. Maybe it's $1 million question. But let me see if I could do that without getting too lost in the weeds here. So the scoping plan in and of itself is just a document the state has. It has no legal status. There's a lot of things that will ultimately advise courts. I am an attorney, by the way, ultimately advise courts on what they do if something goes to litigation, or advise agencies because it's in print. But generally speaking, it's fair to say it is not binding law. It can't force industry to do something. But what the CCLPA says is that the scoping plan, once adopted, shall be advisory as to what the, at least, Department of Environmental Conservation, the lead environmental agency, will do. It essentially mandates that they consider in their ultimate regulations, which are due in 2024, I believe. So it requires DEC and arguably other agencies to write regulations, and regulations are basically laws passed by agencies. They're binding once they're written down. So the scoping plan will be, and must be, according to the law, a guide to how those regulations are written. So it's actually very important because it's like a predictor of what the agencies will do, but also it not only predicts, but when regulations are ambiguous, the scoping plan may in some cases be used by courts and other people interpreting the law as what the agencies meant. And I'm sorry for a little bit of an arcane kind of thing, but essentially the scoping plan is very important, even though it's not technically binding. I hope that answers the question, but it's not something that's easy to answer.
Yeah, thank you, Bob. There's a lot of I just kept telling folks, I feel like we have the hardest, in some ways the hardest ask here within the environmental justice ask, because there are so many bills, there's so many, and the scope of the thing is so huge, and it doesn't appear that our political leaders are equipped really to kind of face down big problems like this. But there is a great question here, I think from Lisa Caswell I wanted to raise, which is, and I see there are other questions in the chat too, we'll try to get to those.
She says, why do they have to get anything done? I assume she's speaking about the legislators, particularly with so many choices. Couldn't that be used as a, I guess to say a smokescreen against any kind of thing to happen? How do we, you know, with our strategy here of saying pick one and pass it, how do we get away from them not doing anything at all?
If I could speak to that briefly,
Sure.
if you look at the first part of the ask, the opening paragraphs, I think what we want to try to communicate is the urgency of the need. That climate change is code red for the planet, as someone has said, or code red for humanity. And you know, our basic ask is that the legislator do something, address this problem in one way or another. Here are 12 pieces of legislation that begin to do that. I don't think we need to get lost in the weeds about, you know, advocating for one or the other, but at least communicate the urgency of the problem and that we need action and need action this year.
I couldn't have said it better.
Is New York State expecting a big and maybe one-time surplus this year? How does that affect how strongly we push for legislation this year?
Yeah.
Part of me wants
So
to say we push for this no matter what.
So thank you for whoever asked that question, because frankly, you prompted me, and it's something I wanted to talk about and forgot. So when somebody in the introduction talked about we're doing $1 billion, I forgot who was saying that. So usually when we advocate before the legislature, the response we get is, yeah, we'd really like to do it, and it costs a lot of money, and the state is in a, you know, is in an austerity situation. We have a deficit. This year they can't use that excuse. The state is flush with cash. And so the original estimate was, I believe it was a $4 or $5 billion surplus. Forgive me, I'm scrambling like everybody else to keep up, but Comptroller DiNapoli issued a report about a week ago, which I haven't had a chance to look at, which found that the deficit is clearly higher than that. And that doesn't even count if the federal government passes, the Congress, I'm sorry, does end up passing some version of the Build Back Better legislation that so many of us support. So it also, this is Governor Hochul's budget, and she has an incentive, quite frankly, to not have a big surplus, because she knows people like us are going to say, well, therefore do something. But even she bragged in her executive budget that for the first time in New York State history, their predictions for the out years going up, I believe, to 2027, they predict a balanced budget for the next like 6-7 years. That has never happened, as far as I know, in state history. It certainly hasn't happened in 20-30 years I've been doing this, but I believe it's never in state history. So they have really no excuse not to make significant expenditures in climate and other priorities. Maybe not as much as we would like, but we need to hammer that home when we talk to legislators, that you do have the money to do many of the things they want. And if you want to be bold, we can also increase revenues on the wealthy. We did that to some extent last year, but we can also do that. There are many things in addition we could do in the revenue side. But even without revenue, there's a lot we could be doing.
Thanks, Bob. One other question that came up was about, this was from Linda Yanone. I hope I pronounced your last name, Linda. Sorry if I butchered it. She asked, how are we coordinating with other states for a regional approach? I think this kind of happened a little bit with, I seem to remember with there was like some sort of economic thing that was formed like 7 or 8 years ago with regards to something about this, but anyway.
Hopefully, and incidentally, I asked that IB the questions. I don't have any objection. Go off mute and clarify. So forgive me. Hopefully, I'm answering Linda's question correctly, but if you mean we, you mean, I'll just say she could have meant either states, the state of New York, or advocates. So,
Advocates and the state both.
okay, great. So the state, and I'm definitely not an expert in interstate in climate policy, but there have been some efforts on certain areas in climate for coordination, not necessarily. So one is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. So that's one in terms of not exactly a carbon tax, but a cap and trade system that's been around for a while. There is a lot of coordination between California and other states for in terms of California being the lead and other states like New York following. But I don't know precisely what you're referring to there. I'm sure there are other things I'm not thinking about. States look to each other for guidance, but my just quick answer is in climate in so many areas, it tends to be a regulatory system, generally speaking, is by state or then on the federal level. But it's an important point, but there's not a huge amount that I can point to that is happening beyond what I've said, but I'm sure there are other things I'm not thinking about. I will say one quick thing in addition to that there are provisions in the CCIA to avoid what are known as leakage, which is, I think, a terrible term, but it's the term in climate policy that basically if we increase taxation or regulation, it'll cause businesses to move to other states to reduce the impact of that happening. But beyond that, again, maybe there are initiatives that I'm not aware of or not thinking about at the moment.
Thank you.
I have a question about this argument about the $15 billion. If I understand this correctly, this is actually going to be an authority, and it's going to be funded by polluters' penalty fees. So is it that there's no political will, or there's little political will to impose those fees, or what's actually going on here?
Okay, so let me just and let me just preface it by saying a little bit of clarity, and it does get complicated. Bear with me. So the authority you referred to, Dahlia, is in the CCIA, not the $15 billion ask.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Okay, but as to your general question about the pushback, and by the way, I'm gonna, every time somebody says, it's not moving or something like that, and caution and say that bills often take years to pass. So the fact even that I'm conceding I don't expect it to pass this year does not mean that it's like dead or not worth working on. Like, the legislature passes like a couple of hundred bills every year, and there's something like 10,000 or more introduced. So just, I have to always caution people about, well, that bill is not going anywhere, however you put it. But in terms of the pushback, first of all, it's important to note that this is not some kind of grassroots thing that people are upset, but the main pushback has been about the CCIA is allegedly a gas tax. And so it's not true. That's the first thing. I could go into that. But it has been seized upon by the fossil fuel industry and frankly the Republican Party as a major means to go after climate action, and particularly the Democrats. This is not my opinion. This is not like rhetoric. I know that a number of state legislators, including mine, put out pretty much the same message around the same time, saying it was a gas tax. So yes, people respond to advertising that is coordinated and effective. So I just want to point out, this is not like suddenly people are spontaneously rebelling against what the CCIA did. But in terms of, forgive me, but you're asking me like on the merits, is it a gas tax? Or if you want to clarify, maybe I the point of your
No,
question.
I'm just asking you politically. I'm very used to government shenanigans and, how you frame things and you say one thing and there actually are other forces behind it that are trying to stop this.
Well-
And I just wanted to get a better sense of that environment. That's all.
Sure. And in addition to what I already said, which is that it's a well-coordinated campaign, I think it's important. I always talk about the merits. Everybody talks about messaging. On the merits, it is not a gas tax. It taxes upstream the fossil fuel industry. Whenever you tax a major corporation, this would be the first time it ever happened. We impose bank taxes. We impose business taxes in New York. There's always a possibility, in fact, a likelihood that business, it's a matter of complex economics, will pass down that. So we're not saying they won't do that, but the advertising campaign made it seem as if it was some kind of unique phenomenon and we were taxing at the pump. We are not. But in terms of that's just the merits. But in terms of how to frame it, what we've discussed within New York Renews is talking about the benefits overall of climate transformation versus some burdens. Yes, so first of all, the CCIA is one of the only pieces of legislation I have ever seen that, first of all, makes people whole. For granted, there will be some increases in their gas and home heating bills, we think. It has this process of reimbursing the bottom 60% or so, 60 to 70% of New Yorkers with a rebate. So it makes most New Yorkers whole. And secondly, as I said, we need to look at the fact that the benefits that climate transformation will ultimately, transition to new renewables will ultimately make. And this is not me saying, the scoping plan said and concluded, this is state agencies who are not known for being particularly bold, that if I remember correctly, I don't want to give the wrong number, but billions and billions of dollars will be, we will be better off if we engage in the transformation that's in the climate plan. And the scoping plan is just filled with the costs of maintaining the current system in the form of health costs, you name it, but health costs, costs of pollution, costs of remediation because of floods. Let's remember we have had at least 3 major floods most recently, or 3 major, people got killed in their basements a year ago. There was Irene, Irene and Sandy about 10 years ago that cost billions of dollars. So another way of saying, if people focus on the narrow sense of will my gas will cost a little bit more for a short period of time for some people to use their gas vehicles, the answer is yes for some people, but overall we think New York will do much better. And by the way, we're transitioning rapidly. We should and we are to electric vehicles and electric heating. So those costs we think will be fairly temporary. Sorry for probably a lengthy answer to a short question.
I don't know, Bob, I appreciate your expertise, your experience, and your knowledge, your depth of knowledge with all this stuff. And it's good for me to hear this stuff. So please don't apologize for that. I appreciate it at least. I got a question. This is a good one from Kevin Conley about who to visit. Who do we lobby? He says, my 2 representatives are each freshmen from the minority party. Should I meet with them or with reps who are in influential positions? My understanding is you need to meet with your personal reps. It doesn't matter what
Well-
part of their forum, but like if you go to an influential ups, they don't want to see you if you're not their constituents. That's my understanding.
Respectfully, I would disagree with that, what you just said, and agree with that.
Thank you.
And people like to say that you should meet with your representative, but this is the reality, not theory. The Democrats totally control the legislature now. You may or may not agree with that, depending on your personal politics, your enrollment, but New York has always been party driven. Frankly, I'm not saying you shouldn't if you've got extra time, but things are done by party. This is not a partisan statement on my part. I would have said don't meet. I didn't spend a lot of time meeting with the Democrats before they took in the Senate, before the Democrats took over the Senate a few years ago. I'm not saying don't do it, but the more important part of John's question is, should I only meet with my legislator? And in a large lobby day like this, yes, it is important to have some constituents there, but it is really, really common to meet with people from throughout the state. And I would spend more time meeting with key legislators like committee chairs, leadership, etc. But again, I guess what I would say is if you have 15 people in the room or in the Zoom room, and two of them, I wouldn't have 15 that don't live in the district, but if you have 2 or 3 who live in the district, they should talk more, but people should speak from the heart, and it will, in my opinion, have an impact. The fact that you're not a constituent shouldn't stop you. It's helpful if you live in the area, though. Yes, I don't spend a lot of time. I live in Rensselaer County. I don't spend a lot of time meeting with New York City legislators. I leave that to the New York City folks. But beyond that, you don't have to live in the district to meet with them.
That's the first time I've heard. Thank you, Bob. That was a really good perspective I hadn't heard before. So, John, is there anything you want to bring up? We have about 5 minutes left for the group here. John, you there? John Paulberg? Okay, we'll move on.
No, I'm sorry, my unmute button wasn't working. I would just encourage people before you make the legislative visits to do a bit of homework and look at some of these bills and find out if your assembly person or senator is already a co-sponsor, and have something to, if they are, to be prepared to acknowledge that, to let them know that you know that, and to thank them. I think it's just helpful to have, some of that knowledge before we go into visits with our legislators.
And if
John,
I could just add to that is, I know we're running out of time, but people tend to lobby one day. If somebody says, I'm going to sponsor the bill or looking at it, I don't know and New York Council of Churches has a process to do that, but if they're not, check with the Council of Churches, but if they're not doing it centrally, I would actually follow up with whoever you met with if it's not being done centrally. They say they're going to sponsor it, call them in a week.
Yep.
To see if they did.
And how do you find out if your legislator is a co-sponsor of the bill?
Very simply, the number of web pages, but the one I happen to use, there's like 5. If you type in New York State Assembly, and you can do it for the Senate too. I just happen to use the Assembly one, and you'll see something you can click to bills. You type in the bill number in a little window, and it'll tell you who sponsored it.
Thank you.
If anybody has any questions, feel free to email me or contact me.
Yeah, it's www.newyorksenate.gov/legislation/bills2021/ and then the bill number. It'll give you all the information on, including
Right,
the.
I'm sorry to interrupt. John gave the Senate webpage. I gave the Assembly, but they're equally good. It's just a matter of personal taste, which you're more accustomed to using.
Thank you. Well, before I know I'm not sure if we have time to answer one more question. So before I try to do that, I simply want to thank Bob for spending so much time with us today. Bob, it was really great to have you here. And like I said, to listen to your expertise and your advice and everything. So thank you so much for taking your time. I also want to say thanks to all of you who are here. Can't see all of you. A lot of you turn off your cameras, but I want to say thanks to all of you. For making environmental justice a priority and for spending your time today listening to the New York State Council of Churches. I really appreciate your time, your efforts, your advocacy, and I hope that God blesses all of our efforts together, that we can make this world a bit more like what God intends. So thank you all very much for everything. So give yourselves some jazz hands, give yourselves some jazz hands.